Retirement, initially resembling a lazy day on a calm lake, has become a surprise storm for many Americans. They expect it's smooth sailing, but it's more like setting up for a great picnic only to have a sudden downpour crash the party.
So, how did we get here and what can be done about it? Well, you're listening to Queer Money episode number 512, and today we're talking with labor economist Teresa Ghilarducci about her new book, Work, Retire, Repeat. After an illustrious 25-year tenure at Notre Dame, Teresa joined the New School for Social Research in 2008.
Teresa spent her career advocating for pension reform and wrote this book. Join us for a beefy discussion, as Teresa would say, to hear how you can join the new Great Deal movement. Now, on with the show.
With no fees or minimums and no overdraft fees, banking with Capital One is the easiest decision in the history of decisions. That's banking reimagined. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com/bank for details. Capital One, N.A., member FDIC. Well, Teresa Ghilarducci, we are really excited to have you on the Queer Money podcast today. Welcome.
I'm really excited to be here.
Likewise. We were talking before the show, when YouTube starts recommending someone to you, maybe reach out to them and try to connect with them. And that's kind of, I guess, in a circuitous way, that's kind of what we did with you. So we're excited to have this discussion because we have a retirement crisis in America, but we didn't share this with you before the show, but one of the most reoccurring questions we get from our listeners and viewers is, I'm 50, I'm 60 years old, typically LGBT, more often than not a gay man, and I haven't done anything to save for retirement. What can I do? What options do I have? And, obviously there are options, but they're just not as plentiful. And you talk about the retirement crisis in America because we got rid of pensions in the 80s. So can you kind of like lay the landscape from your economic perspective, your expert perspective of where we land, or where we're sitting right now in the retirement crisis?
Well, we've had a 40-year experiment, starting with Reagan, when that administration cut Social Security benefits for basically boomers. Anybody who was 25 and under in the early 1980s were going to get lower Social Security benefits. And what happened is the experts say, well, that won't be a problem because you can also, save for retirement in 401k plans or individual retirement account plans. At the same time, Social Security was cut back. Government policy went after unions, and unions were declined. So the same couple of year period where we cut Social Security, we also experienced the air traffic controller strike, which was a signal to unions, that you're not going to have as much power. So it really was a period of, hey, you don't have unions, you're not going to have as much Social Security, you're really on your own. Why were unions important in developing retirement plans? Because they set forth an example in the bigger industries, state and government and local employment, as well as manufacturing, all the famous ones you've heard about, for a defined benefit plan. And you didn't have to be in a union to get the benefit of a union because the standard model was a defined benefit plan. A defined benefit plan was a promise by companies or your employer to pay you a certain amount after you retired. And you didn't have to retire after 30 years. It could have been even 5 years or 10 years. But what they promised was a stream of income for the rest of your life. Add that up to other streams of income, including Social Security and a little bit of savings, maybe some house equity, and most people were going to be okay. But 40 years of a decline in Social Security, a decline in unions, decline in defined benefit plans meant that most of us were told, hey, you should save on your own if you want to retire. And that savings goal was quite high for a median income worker, now making about $60,000. They needed $500,000 to be able to supplement their new lower Social Security to be secure. For somebody above the median, maybe $80,000, $100,000 a year worker in today's dollars, we need about $750 to $1 million per year.
Mm-hmm.
So that was supposed to be engineered with tax cuts and voluntary savings, but it never happened. People, for lots of reasons that you've talked about on your show, people did not save that requisite 15% of their paycheck starting at the age of 30. A lot of normal reasons and reasons that people should not be ashamed of. The structure of that system did not serve the needs of human workers. It wasn't that the human workers somehow had some distortions or did something wrong to not work in that system. So I wanted to get all that in, but we're now, just to anticipate your question, okay, after this 40 years, this experiment with the do-it-yourself systems, 401k system is over, and most baby boomers are now at the cusp of retirement. What has that wrought? Half the people will not have enough money to maintain their living standards. Almost half of middle-class workers will be downwardly mobile into poverty or near poverty. That means we need a lot of public policy solutions. It's really hard for an individual to kind of correct that. But it also means some lessons for people who are 50 or 40 that we can talk about. So the fix is both collective, a government fix, and also some things that individuals could do.
Absolutely.
So it sounds, just to kind of maybe encapsulate what you just said here, that since the 80s, this experiment has really been, let's shift some or all of the responsibility of being prepared for retirement from corporations and government to the individuals, right?
Yeah, very well said. It was that 40-year experiment was shifting the risk. And that's sort of what happens in do it yourself. Do your own electricity, you take on the risk of blowing up your house.
Great example. It can work fabulously, or it could be fabulously,
Right.
like
right.
you said, an explosion.
Oh my goodness.
I'm not going to be a little sarcastic here, but I mean to do that to make a point. This was also a period of ideological change and a dominance of the free market ideas and trade, or an ideology of individual liberty. And there's nothing wrong with individual freedom, or liberal trade, but it went overboard. This was this hope that an individual is an island unto themselves.
Yeah.
And if they could decide in their own house, what they wanted to do for their own retirement. And it's very appealing. I mean, it was part of the queer and gay movement, was that you should get out of my bedroom. We went a little too far to say that there was nothing that government could do, collectively to help with our security. One last thing is, this has big political implications. People turn to government to provide some vehicles for economic security. And the places where we have seen the rise in authoritarianism or populism in our country and also the rest of the world are places where economic security has declined the most. So places in the United States where people have lost access to good health care or pensions are actually places that shifted from voting Democratic or moderate Republican to places that have shifted towards sort of a radical right. So the loss of economic security means a lot more than just what happens in a household.
Yeah, very important and timely to share. So there's a lot to unpack there. Maybe I was naive, but I was always under the impression that, I was a child, born in the 70s, grew up in the 80s, and I was always under the impression that part of the reason why pensions went to the wayside was because they were just expensive and hard to sustain, because there was a lot of unpredictability to them. And I remember, a lot of our listeners are going to know this, but we all remember that Golden Girls episode where Rose Nyland was about to lose her pension and become the bag lady on the street because Charlie's pension was becoming insolvent. And that was, hearing, guess what I picked up in the media at that time, and seeing a show like that, I just thought, like, okay, well, the only logical next step was, a 401k or something comparable. But so it sounds like you're saying that was sort of the truth of that was kind of stretched or misunderstood.
Yeah, it is true that if you just rely on one employer for your pensions, you're going to face the risk of the illiquidity of that employer. Fortunately, in the United States, we have a pension benefit guarantee corporation that in the 70s was formed, and it says any company that goes bankrupt will actually pay the pension. So that I don't know what happened to that person, and I will have to look at that episode, but all that pension wasn't gone. Some of it was there, but it could be reduced, and that's a risk. And that's why relying on just an employer for your plan isn't a good idea. So I don't want to go back to that single employer system. I want a hybrid system. And it's also true this is not a pro-union solidarity forever episode, but it's important to know what kinds of systems we have here that worked. Unions will often negotiate for people in many other employers, like the construction workers that are working outside my window now.
Mhm.
All of them, are covered by a pension plan through their union, even though they go from employer to employer. And on top of that defined benefit plan, they also have a 401k. And this makes the point that every person in America, union or not, needs a layered approach to retirement. You need your Social Security to be stable. You need an employer plan that you may have gotten from several employers. You need your own private investment, and you probably need some assets to pay for your living expenses.
Right.
The mission of Queer Money is to financially empower the LGBTQ plus community. Join us in thanking Capital One for supporting that mission.
Just to break away for a second, folks, this is interesting. I'm glad you're saying this, because this is something that we are definitely encouraging our listeners and watchers is that multiple streams of income do help you reduce that risk, right? It's just like with investing in the stock market, you need diversity, right? And the same thing is here, is we need diversity of our incomes. But what I find so interesting that you're talking about here is that at the same time, these folks, many baby boomers, were experiencing reductions or potential reductions in these multiple streams of income, right? And that's why you say you can't rely too heavily on one of them or even two of them, because if one or two of them tank, then you are in serious trouble.
Yeah. It is important to diversify, and not only your assets, but also your streams of income. So what's a person to do in their 50s? First, really know that the government is a very important financial partner. It's going to be one of your most important financial partners. The stream of income coming from Social Security could be worth from $350,000 to $650,000, depending upon how long you live and what your income is. So that is a big chunk, 350 to 650. Your Medicare is going to be a very important source of support and security. So you need to make sure that representatives in government really support those two programs. That's very important for your own financial future. So if you're not a voter, at least you should vote on that issue and pay attention to that. The solution to problems are always power, and power requires knowing what levers you can pull, what tools you have. Because if you don't know how much resources you have and levers you have, you won't have maximum power. So one of your levers is your existence as a voter. Use it. The other lever you have is as a consumer. And that's a consumer of your everyday needs and what you need for your older self. I was fascinated with one of your podcasts where you talked about hyperbolic discounting and whether or not the AIDS crisis, 30 years ago, had created a mindset in a community of just shorter lives and of fatality. And we know that with medical advances that gay longevity is catching up. There was a terrible, horrible, disastrous drop, in the 80s before the medication, but that seems to have dissipated. There are other sources of social factors that create lower longevity for queer people. Transgender is another issue, but for most gays and lesbians, the mortality rates are about the same as the general population. Add to a community focus on health. You don't smoke as much as other generations. Your longevity is probably going to exceed at some point the general population. But I'm wondering if that hyperbolic discounting or that supercharged consumerism is still there in the community. If it is, people should examine the reason why they buy things, branded things, and really know that that's a lever they can pull, know the psychology of dopamine and desire that fuels that every day, and try to control it. David, you said your son went to Parsons, and Parsons actually tries to construct a demand for and a desire for brands. I mean, part of good design and part of fashion marketing is to spur that dopamine. Well, I tried to teach Parsons students, so that's where I am, to actually know what social effect that's going to have, and they really understand it. All right, so everybody knows that. The other lever to pull is your investment lever. You as an individual, if you're going to start saving because you did stop consuming 100% or even more of what you earned, you're going to all of a sudden become a saver investor. And this is where I'm really afraid for Americans because they're told to save. Most people try to do the right thing. Some people actually are in a situation where they can save substantial amounts. But who manages that money? What are the conflicted interests of your managers? What are the conflicted interests of your advisors? And so in my little book, How to Retire with Enough Money, and not my new book, I really point out it's very important to pick a financial advisor that you can trust. And the only financial advisor you can trust is someone who's a fiduciary. And that means the fiduciary doesn't get any money from the products that they recommend, that they only get money from you. And so, if you are worried about your own finances, get yourself a therapist in the guise of a financial planner, and that person will charge you maybe $700 to $1,000, for a number of sessions. But it's hard to do that when there are a lot of advisors say, "Oh, my advice is free." This is where there's no such thing as a free lunch. The pithy statement is absolutely true. Those advisors are conflicted advisors. You have to really pay attention to the fees that you pay for your asset, your mutual funds. If you have a portfolio that charges 3%, but a non-conflicted advisor or a Vanguard account, for instance, charges you only 2% or 1%, that can add up to a 20%, 30% decrement to your nest egg over time. So fees really make important. And then the other lever you can pull is your work lever. One of the ways that you can help plan for your retirement, ironically, is to work a little bit longer. But to rely on this working longer myth as our only solution to the retirement crisis is a big mistake for a society and a big mistake for an individual.
Absolutely. There's a lot of great advice there, and we appreciate that. And it's nice to know that somebody listens to our podcast.
Yeah. I really like that one. It was really interesting.
No, thank you. So what you touched on there last, I think is really critical. Yeah. One of mine and David's concerns is that we are at a crisis level, but it seems like none of our leaders want to really actually embrace this topic and do something. I know it was a great back and forth exchange between Biden and the Republicans one or two State of the Unions ago, but it doesn't seem like it's gotten much further. And I just read an article recently that said 80% of House Republicans released a budget to raise the retirement age from 69 or to 69. And you argue that raising the rate, I want to make sure I articulate share this correctly, that raising the retirement age is a lot like making eating more affordable by skipping lunch.
Yeah,
is that right?
Right. I mean, all the spreadsheet models, and my compatriots in the academic sphere love to do simulations, kind of a what if statements. And we all do what if scenarios on our spreadsheets. 40 years ago, those same experts, had a person at 25 get a job, save, 10% for 42 years, and earn 6% return, never take the money out for any other reason, kept it in for retirement, never paid overpriced fees, never had a layoff period, and they always got a raise. So when you put those little parameters in an Excel spreadsheet, everybody was fine.
Looks great.
Well, 40 years later, a lot of people suffered through recessions, had job losses, took money out, had divorces, um, um, lots of reasons why humans would not be able to do that with that 40 years. So now the spreadsheets say, oh, just extend your work life for a while, and that will solve the problem because one, you'll save more during that period of time that you're working, like in your 60s. You won't draw down your 401k that you were supposed to have accumulated, and you could delay claiming Social Security. And the other way that you'll be able to afford your retirement is that you've cut your retirement period by 4 more years. And I just found that so ironic. And that's what I came up with that metaphor. Well, sure, we could all afford lunch, if we would just skip it. So we all could afford retirement if Americans just worked longer and shrunk their already really small retirement period. I mean, we really need to get out of the mindset that somehow budget the realities of the market and the realities of our lifespan and the realities of our economy sentence us to only have 10 to 13 years of retirement, because all the other countries like Canada and our other peer countries in other parts of the world have very similar demographics, very similar economic structures, and their retirement periods are 10 to double what our retirement periods are. So there's something quite weird about the Americans that over this time we've shortened our retirement periods, whereas the rest of our peers have actually increased them.
Yeah, and we all saw what happened last year when France said that they were going to.
They were now.
Right, when France said that they were going to, we're going to increase the retirement age, the
Yeah.
public went apoplectic, and the rest of us, and I think it kind of speaks to this idea of power, right?
Yeah.
I think when we see things like this as Americans, we see these kinds of things. Well, the government's going to raise the retirement age to 69. We all just sit back and say, well, we don't have any power or ability to control that.
Yeah.
And what you were saying earlier
Yeah.
is we absolutely do.
It's I think it's because the French they're not ashamed of wanting to have a retirement period or demanding from their government and their employers to just fix it, arrange a period so they could have a good life. There's something about our American system, the do-it-yourself system, that embeds shame and therefore weakness. And a lack of legitimacy for a retirement period. That's what happens with a do-it-yourself system. If you're required to like fix your own electricity and it blows up, you have nobody but yourself to blame. And so when we have a do-it-yourself system, you have an ideology of save or just work longer. And so the cultural differences are probably, are there, of course, but we can make too much of those cultural differences. The French people are very much like the American people. It's just that our systems are really different.
Yeah.
And that's what I've tried for 40 years, because they cut Social Security on me when I was, too young to do anything about it, is to say to Americans, hey, what you fought for since Social Security was established, a dignified off-ramp to the world of work, is a good thing. I wanted to name my book, it's called Work, Retire, Repeat, but I did want to name it In Praise of Retirement, or Let's Come Praise Retirement, because a big part of my book describes the healthy effects of retirement, the healthy effects of controlling the pace and content of your own time. I think the French already knew that, and that's when they hit the streets when Macron, their president, raised and successfully raised the retirement from 62 to 64. We're not even fighting against the politicians that want to raise it up to 70.
Right.
So I hope my book has an effect on that. At least we can demand a retirement. And the truth of it is that most Americans can't wait till 70. There's just nothing about our economic system that makes that possible for most people to to count on a job, up until age 70. Health, skill obsolescence, the demand for the desires of employers are such that a 68-year-old is not welcome in most workplaces.
Yeah. Did you have something?
Well, I was just going to say that the video that we saw you in yesterday, that we were just watching on YouTube, and along comes this video about people who are in their 50s, and what is happening to them economically. And granted, this was 4 years ago, and it was just right before the pandemic, I think, when that came out. So the issues that you were talking about in that particular, or that episode, PBS NewsHour episode, expose was specifically talking about, was this idea that the game really has not, it has not been in the favor of the American public ever since all of this started to happen. We look at, wages have not kept up. It's you talked about in these spreadsheets or these scenarios that people would get a raise every year. We've definitely have seen that. We've seen that older workers now are having to take on 2 or 3 jobs to be earning what they were earning when they were in their mid 40s, sometimes early 50s. Now you have people who are in their 50s, maybe early 60s, working 3 jobs. Physically, their bodies just can't handle that.
Yeah. So in my book, I'm careful to point out just the variability of people in their 50s. We're at 10, we're almost all the same.
Yeah.
At 50s, the differences in our skill levels, where we landed in our industries, our health, somehow our habits, our environments, and our genes kind of catch up to us. And there's a lot of differences in our 50s. If you are in your 60s and you're able to hold down 3 jobs, oddly, you're one of the lucky ones. Now you will probably be breaking down your health, and so your mortality is going to be higher, and your morbidity, your sicknesses, your weak knees, your worn out hips, your isolation, oddly, because you don't have time to engage with your family and friends, may actually increase your mortality. But your income is not as low as the people who have been forced out of the labor market in their late 50s. I really want to end this episode with a conversation about how it could be better, but I really have to paint this dismal picture, because in doing this book, and it really started about 10 to 8 years ago, and I was collecting all this data, I was surprised that things were worse than I thought. And I was asked to really assess how older workers, remember, that's the big bulge of the baby boomers, were going to do right around the time of the pandemic, right around the time of the pandemic. And to my horror, I really focused on what the labor market looked like for 52-year-olds and above. At the same time, the rhetoric of the politicians and the experts were, hey, everything will be fine if you just work till 70. Because what I found is that only half of people between 51 and 62 have continuous employment. For many, the period of retirement or off-ramping happens a lot earlier than like 65. For many reasons, many of them are discrimination and bigotry. Workers are pushed out starting in their 50s. Just their skill levels or their own bodies doesn't keep pace with the kind of demands on the job. One myth that I want to dispel is this idea that the computers have made it easier for older people to stay in the labor market. And the truth is the opposite. Computers have increased surveillance of workers. The Amazon worker, who's disproportionately an older person, has a little earpiece in their ear telling them basically to move faster, monitoring how fast they're doing. The older worker in front of a screen seems like it's inside work, it's not cold, not hot, and you're sitting down, is also a taskmaster that surveils that worker and has that insurance clerk put in more claims faster and faster. And so the computer has actually made the demands for keen eyesight, intense concentration, and physical labor increase so that older workers don't even catch a break there.
Oh,
So
wow.
I found a lot, I call it the liminal period between 52 and 70 as being a lot more insecure than the spreadsheet would suggest, that somehow you could just work up until you can collect your full retirement from Social Security, or you can work up until you get Medicare, or you can work up until the point that your 401k has increased. But I have to bring up another fact in this whole retirement policy is the big difference, or what I call the tale of two retirements, the tale of two lives,
Mhm.
is the people who are making um, policy on retirement, the academics, and the politicians live a charmed life. And they may be projecting their own ability to keep their jobs, their own ability to save, their own wage increases onto the bottom 90%. And so this idea that you can just work longer, get raises, 2 or 3% above inflation every year, and get meaning from your job is only a characteristic of people who are the bosses of their own universes, and whose skills and abilities may actually increase over time. But for most people, that isn't true. And it's alarming that that retirement is a period for some, or having to be retired is a period of shame, or a moment of shame.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting because as I was reading your book, I'm thinking here, Madonna's 65, she's going on another world tour again, and Janet's about ready to go out on tour again, and Nancy Pelosi, they can't get Mitch McConnell to leave, and he's like, he's 80, and we got presidents who are 80 running. So it's just kind of seems like, okay, well, we're all just living longer, so we're all able to
Yeah.
work longer. It just seems like that's a logical solution, but as you're articulating, it's almost, it's the lazy solution, and it's almost inconsiderate because not everybody has the luxury to be able to go on a world tour
Yeah.
sponsored by a billionaire.
I mean, I think in a world of inequality, where wealth inequality, and as you said, earnings inequality has just been so distorted over the past 40 years, where the bottom half of the workforce hasn't even gotten a raise. I mean, in the 1970s, they have a higher inflation adjusted income than they do now. And a lot of people in the bottom 90% have had periods of non-employment because of the instability of the market, um, that the people, that the elites, are just further and further away, from the rest of the people. And so our presidential candidates, our leaders in Congress, our academics who have tenured jobs, I'm kind of in a medieval situation where I'm a medieval priest, I can't be fired. That is what we call in statistics the tail. There's a big distribution and there's a little tiny tail. Well, the people in power are in that little tiny tail.
Mm.
And so my book is to bring that reality forward. And in order to bring that reality forward, I have to set the stage for a bold new set of policies that I call the Gray New Deal, for actually a good reason.
Absolutely. So I do want to dive into that. I do want to end on a positive note, but I think I want to share with a lot of our listeners and viewers, because this surprised me. You say several times throughout the book that there's a large contingency, almost all workers over the age of 66 who are collecting Social Security are still working because the Social
Yes.
Security isn't helping them make ends meet. And I think the reason I want to share that is because I just know so many of our listeners are waiting for Social Security to be their solution. And
Yeah.
it's just not, I don't know where you can live in the country where that's actually a solution.
Yeah, so Social Security is still the most important source of stable income for almost all Americans, except for that little tail.
Mhm.
Even though it's been cut, I don't want to discourage people from supporting Social Securities because
Right, absolutely.
it be eroded. We could actually beef it up. I'm a vegan, so that's kind of a hard word to use, but make it secure. um, and so it's important to do that. But it is the lifeline. It is the hope for most people approaching a period of their life, and it could be in their mid 50s or late 50s when they know that their employer is looking at them funny, or their knees and their back just isn't what it used to be, or that fatigue, really locks in at 6 o'clock at night. That they just know that the labor market is looking at them funny, and they look to Social Security as their lifeline. Well, in the United States, you can start collecting Social Security at 62. And that looks like free money. But those cuts that I told you about in the Reagan administration back in the 80s had cut that benefit at 62 to 10 to about 10 to 15% less than what it was. So if you could wait until you're 70 to collect your benefit, you would get, let's say, $1,000. If you do collect it at 62, you only get $750
Right.
per month. So it's a huge discount from what you can get. But, for that hyperbolic discounter, for the person who doesn't have that much of a choice, at least it's something. And what you forewent isn't as important as what you can get now. But $750 dollars per month is not enough to live on. So people may be collecting and working at the same time. And that's a short-term solution that has lethal consequences. And I really do mean lethal. If you're in a position where you're having to take that money, you're probably in a job where you do a lot of stooping and bending. There's still a lot of physical labor, maybe not in construction, but in home health care or in janitorial services or even in retail or the Amazon warehouse. And you're probably in a situation where you are subordinate, that you are being told what to do, maybe by your patient or your client, or maybe by your boss. And that kind of a job, coupled with low income, can actually hasten your death and your morbidity. So that's lethal in that way.
Right.
It's also kind of lethal because you forewent all those gains in Social Security monthly income you could have had if you had just waited to claim. Now, some people don't have a choice. They're not stupid. They know that if they waited till 63, 64, they'd have enough money. So I'm not blaming the victim. But we set it up, and it's almost an unintended consequences of that reduction, that there are some people stuck in this work claiming part of life that creates more inequality of health, more inequality of longevity, and more inequality in just standard of living at retirement. I really have dedicated my research to inform policymakers that if they intended to cut Social Security before 70 to encourage people to work until later and claim later, it didn't work. That most people are just claiming as soon as they can, and the beneficiaries are actually the employers
Right.
who don't have to pay as much because the Social Security supplements their low wage older workers. So the unintended consequences is that it benefits these low wage industries like home health care, personal health care, but it really doesn't benefit the individual.
Do you think that's part of the reason why there doesn't seem to be enough of an appetite to come up with a solution, because companies are benefiting so much and they're telling the politicians, hey, keep it this way because it works for us?
Yeah, I mean, the part of the task of a reformer, political reformer, is to make sure that all parts of the economy know that, parts of the stakeholders, that they're being harmed by this. And a powerful stakeholder doesn't feel that urgency. And that powerful stakeholder is the corporation and corporate power. So yeah, they're not feeling the pain. Actually, a lot of industries are building their business model based on the availability of low wage labor from elders. Like, we've run out of teenagers. Women aren't, the reserve army of labor that used to be. There's a backlash against immigrants. So where do you go? You go to that big increase in population among the elderly. So they like a desperate labor force. Then I turn to young people and say, one myth that you've heard, and that is that there are greedy geezers out there taking your benefits away from your children and your families, is actually just not true. I've looked at 168 countries over 40 years, and look to see who spends money on pensions and who spends money and how much money those countries spend on education and children and family benefits. And I found a positive correlation, not a negative correlation, meaning that the countries that spend the most on children and families are also the countries that spend the most on the elderly. So that it seems to be that if you fund the young and the old, that's a winning solution, that you have a healthy economy. And we could choose to fund both. It's not a trade-off.
Right.
The Republicans that want to cut your Social Security aren't going to put more money in the child tax credit exemption or more in funded childcare. It's a political coalitions for one is the same political coalition for the other. Young workers also are hurt when older workers compete for their jobs. That there are some jobs where the old and the young are complementary, but a lot of sectors of the economy, they're just competing against each other. I know that's true. If I stay in my tenured post until I'm 80, I'm blocking the PhD that I trained, from getting a good 10-year job. So sometimes the substitution is that great. It also, having people work longer and not have retirement hurts communities where the elder consumption power is not as great. And those communities also might be on the hook to pay for elder housing subsidies, energy subsidies, and Medicare and Medicaid will be spending more for those impoverished elders. So there's a lot of stakeholders that could benefit from a robust retirement system. They just might not see it as directly as the
Right.
economists do.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
No.
I see your brain churning. I feel like he's doing math in his head right now.
No, well, one of
It
the
looks
things
like it,
that
right?
I did kind of want to go back to this. One of the things that we talked about briefly earlier, and that you mentioned a number of times in your book, is about how all of these changes that have happened over the decades have really targeted and hurt individuals who are already being suppressed or at a disadvantage in our economy, and how you just kind of mentioned it here for a second here. You talked about individuals who are working these types of jobs, right? Janitorial jobs, labor jobs, things like that. And we oftentimes see those fall on individuals like immigrants, people of color, individuals who are start off life behind the eight ball for a variety of reasons. Maybe they're leaving a home where they are not, they don't feel supported or welcome. So they start their earning career doing labor jobs like that because they're desperate, and then they just get stuck in that.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about how that just trails into what is happening in retirement?
Yeah, we call that life cycle disparities. And those life cycle disparities accumulate, they add up. And so if you just take the queer community, LGBTQ plus community, those are populations that start out life a little bit marginalized. They may not have the family support. Teaching at Notre Dame, the University of Notre Dame for 25 years, and that was an institution that had in its charter that if an applicant revealed themselves, to be gay, they could be denied admission to the school. You could be dismissed for being out. And that created all sorts of marginalization and isolation. So I worked with many students to lift that up, to come out. And my student was one of the first PhDs in economics that looked at the economic effects of being closeted. And those effects were greater health risk. And we also found that closeted gays did not have the wage penalty, that out gays did. So the further you're away from the dominant gender, the further down you are in the wage scale, was our conclusion, or his conclusion. So I marginalized communities are isolated communities. They don't have relatives that are rich or that will transfer rich to them. And they are often in jobs that don't have the economic security that people in the tail have. A tenured professor could stay at the University of Chicago their entire lives and get their increases. Those periods of unemployment in a do-it-yourself system are lethal, to a retirement account. You know that because you all are numbers guys. That if you put $100 in an account and add to it $100 to it every month, you can actually get real sums after 40 years. But take it out when the stock market is down and you've lost your job. You've taken it out at a time where the potential for it to build up is at its highest. You've lost your job at the period of time in which, if you had your job and accumulated money in your 401k, you would have bought stocks and bonds at their lowest level. But since the economy was doing badly, you were marginalized from that economy. Add up those kinds of periods of time where you sold low and bought high, and then you get a disparities in wealth. And over the past 40 years, I testified in the U.S. Banking Committee to show that the disparities of retirement wealth have only gotten worse over time because of this. The nature of our retirement system depends upon the vagaries not only of the stock market, but the vagaries of the job market. And part of retirement security is actually stable relationships. Part of economic security is actually having relatives that don't need to glom on to your retirement accounts. And glomming on sounds pejorative. It could be that you're in a community where you share the wealth with each other. This is especially a problem among Hispanic communities or Black communities, or mothers who take care of their children, that those family webs are important, but they also are ones that rely on whatever wealth you accumulated to help them through their economic problems. So that's a whole mosaic of issues based on class, on socioeconomic class, and the mosaic of those issues are such with a 401k system that that 401k system only works for a small group of people who have the job and the wealth accumulation and the family structure that works for that. And that happens to be the elite that make our policy.
Right. So it just seems that there's not a whole lot of opportunity for anybody to make a mistake throughout their lives, or for certain, especially certain populations, can't make a mistake. They can't have any accidents, any unintended consequences. Otherwise, they're going to be more marginalized than they are.
Right. Like
That's
you said
amazing.
earlier, unless your life is the picture perfect spreadsheet,
Yeah.
and like you said, only the people at the tail, those people in the tail end of that distribution are those individuals, then you're in a situation where you're really screwed.
Yeah. And that's like not a small group,
Right,
I'm
no.
talking about sort of a small group of construction workers who can't work longer, or a small group of people who had these weirdo, hyperbolic discounting, or this small group that were laid off or their hours were reduced, when there was a recession. I'm talking about most people,
Right.
Right.
most people. And so we need a system that's flexible, where mistakes can be made, or an economy can fluctuate, and your whole future selves, or the future selves of our workers are not dependent upon being lucky. We have to have a system that it has insurance. The Social Security system is really forgivable. It requires after 35 years, you get a benefit based on your highest paid 35 years. And those 35 years can be earned at all sorts of periods of your life. If you work as a teenager and then take off time for college, and then you come back and you take off time to care for family members, and you come back in again, it's forgiving. The 401k system is not forgiving. You've lost out on the contributions forever. The defined benefit system was forgiving. You got laid off at Ford's, but your money stayed in your system, and it grew and grew and grew while you were like searching around for a job, but your money didn't take time off, or your money wasn't laid off. In a 401k system, it is.
Interesting. I never thought about it that way. That this is, all very eye-opening to us. So, like we said, we don't want to end up on a negative tone.
Yeah.
So that's, well, and all throughout reading the book, where I'm like, oh my God, this is just dismal. Like, I hope she has a solution. I hope this isn't just like a, I don't know, like
Doom.
doom and gloom
We actually were
book.
reading. We were reading a portion of it while we were driving back and forth between Toledo, Ohio, and central Pennsylvania for Easter, and it was kind of funny because we would read like a paragraph and then we would talk for like 20 minutes, and we're like, okay, we got to get back to the book because there were so many aha moments and so many, oh, this is why this is happening. This makes so much sense. Why are there are so many people in our economy that are in these situations that, you know, for lack of a better way of saying it, where we do see this judgment and guilt and shame and pressure put on these individuals, like, why in the hell didn't you have your life in order to you got to this point? And then you read this kind of commentary and the data that you have in here, and you're like, how in the hell did you get so lucky that you ended up in a life like that compared to the rest of us?
Yeah, I know. And then an economy that requires luck, rather than sort of hard work and aspiration, is an economy doomed to kind of fatalism, and lack of innovation. I mean, I can make this argument that you need security in order to have growth, but that's for another day. What we need to, well, that is actually for today, because I have to convince the elites that we are at a point where we need a new deal, just at that crisis point in the Great Depression. We're not only were 30% of the people out of work, so that actually got a lot of attention, but the communist and socialist parties were actually gaining ground in many areas of the country. There was a real, and fascism was growing in other parts of the world. So there was a real fight for democracy, and that fight, one of those levers for that fight was actually a New Deal, social insurance for all workers. We may be at that point where we need something really bold. It's a little more slow moving, shielded from view by the elites, but still a crisis, when many of us will have to take care of our older parents because they had a bad deal, over the past 40 years. The other part of the solution is a gray New Deal. And in some ways, I want to lift up the color, as a prominent color. Gray is beautiful, because that takes away from the shame of going gray or of getting old, and really fights against this American idea of never say die, that somehow we can stay young forever. It's just part of the human condition, something we can't choose and we should embrace. So a gray New Deal means two things. One, for the older people that want to work, their jobs should be better. More enforcement against bigotry and discrimination, to be sure, but also to give some employers a break by lowering the Medicare age and making it the first payer, an insurance payer, than required from the employer. And that means instead of an employer paying $30,000 a year for an older worker's retirement, they would only pay $5,000 because they would just supplement Medicare. That would really help older workers keep their good jobs if they have one. We also need to enforce job safety rules, and that takes another whole range of job regulations. So I have a list of things to do to improve jobs, and actually that would improve jobs for young and older workers. So there's a coalition there of workers to improve their jobs. Higher wages, better safety conditions, etc. The other part of the New Deal is just to embrace, like the French, we need to provide a dignified off-ramp for people who can't work or choose not to work. What about choosing not working until you die? We did the same thing when we demanded a weekend, or we demand Martin Luther King's holiday. We as workers need rest, relaxation. And that period of time after a lifetime of work is really special, because actually it's the last one you're going to have. You're going to die. And time before you die is time that's getting scarce, and something that's more scarce is more valuable. The psychologists and psychoanalysts tell me, and I had a stack of these books right near my computer when I was writing this book to give me a vision of what this book was about. It was Eric Fromm's book, on the stages of life. And the last stage of life is really important. It's a stage in which you create your own personal narrative about what your life is like. And it's also a period of generativity that you want to give back. Well, you can't do that if you're working at Walmart. You know, you need that period of time. I also found that people enhance their relationships with other people if they have time at the time of their life, and they also enhance their own. They find themselves. And if we deny that to the bottom 90% and only give it to the elites, we now this is the value statement. The economists usually can't weigh in on this, but that's a decision, for all Americans. Okay, so now we say we have a democracy that says, yeah, we want a pension. How do you do it? The first thing you do is you shore up Social Security and you expand Social Security. So adding $200 a month to all Social Security benefits. Elizabeth Warren, when she was running for president, actually modeled that. I did a little bit of work for her experts, and I thought it was actually a pretty good idea. It was affordable, and it would bring up the bottom. $200 to somebody only getting $1,000 a month is worth a lot more and a bigger percentage increase to somebody who's getting $4,000 a month from Social Security. But everybody should get it because it's a universal program. And we have to put more revenue into the system. I wonder if the House Republicans who say they want to cut Social Security benefits by raising the retirement age will actually be popular. I'm puzzled by why they would say that when they're trying to get votes, because it's really not popular. So is it ideology, trumping, not, no pun intended, overwhelming, sort of, ordinary politics? But most people don't want a cut in Social Security. And the other thing we need to do is make sure that everybody has a pension. Regardless if they're lucky or regardless if they make that decision, on the job or have an employer, lucky enough to have an employer that has a pension. So I've advocated for basically a universal pension where the government matches the contribution up to 5% for people making below the median income, which is about $60,000. So that's a lot I just said, but the simple way to say it, if I could sum it up, because I can see Dave wanting to do that, is we need better jobs, but we also need better Social Security and universal pensions for all.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm just gonna share this. John and I, again, watching YouTube, we watched there's a channel called More Perfect Union, and they did an expose on a small town in Tennessee where Ford was coming in and building a factory where they were going to manufacture parts for for electric vehicles, and they had unionized, and it was so interesting to hear these individuals who were surviving on jobs where they were making $7.25, $8, $9 an hour, now being in a position where they had a union behind them, where they were going to be earning anywhere from $25 to $30 an hour. They would have these kinds of benefit programs, and just the conversation about how they talked about how their lives were the projection of where they saw their lives going, right?
Yeah.
These are people who lived in the far eastern side of Tennessee, so they were part kind of Appalachian mentality kind of individuals of living in this desperate life, to all of a sudden hear these people talking about how they're going to be able to build generational wealth for their children and for their grandchildren. And I think that that's something that all of us need, that potential, that prospect of knowing how better your life would be, even in retirement, if you knew that not only were you taking care of yourself, but you're taking care of future generations.
Totally. That summarizes what the word dignity is, rather than shame. If that's the opposite poles, that you have a dignity because you can take care of yourself, that you're actually in a pool of workers that are taking care of each other. You're a community of homeowners, community of people who have pooled their resources to have a good pension. And you have dignity because you can take care of your dependents. If that's the American dream, it's kind of modest, and it's not about getting rich. It's not about striking on your own. It's not about leaving your community. I was on a panel at a literary festival this weekend with Angus Deaton, who wrote a book with his co-author Ann Case called Deaths of Despair. And his new book is on the American dream. And our books really complement each other because we talk about our data is showing what people want. And it is this economic security. It's even more important than equality. You know, that I mentioned that before at the beginning of the podcast, is that societies move towards fascism or move towards authoritarianism when they've lost security, not because some people have gotten rich, inequality have grown. What they really react against is taking away their dignity. And I think that's why the French were protesting in the street, is that I had a dignified life cycle, and you government, in the guise of not being able to afford it, or you government in the guise of free market, are taking that away from me. That gets them to the street. And there's some disconnect between the American vision for themselves and everybody else. I also want to end this our conversation by saying how different we are from everybody else. The poverty rates among Americans is quadruple and double that of our peers. It's 24%. We have 24% elder poverty in the United States compared to Denmark's 3%. And I know the Scandinavian countries look kind of oddballs, and whenever we talk about what we could do, we like point to Sweden, like, who can imagine that? So forget about the Scandinavian countries. They're just odd. Let's talk about ordinary, like capitalist, greedy countries like the Netherlands or the Germans or even the French. Everybody there wants to be, they're a lot like us. Well, their poverty rates are at 8%,
Right.
of elders. So there is a possibility, a policy possibilities curve or a frontier that we're not even close to. And a lot of it has to do with our pension system and and the shame and the lack of political will that system has actually created.
Absolutely. It sounds like there's some appetite to address lowering the age for Medicare. What can our listeners and viewers do to help you convince those who have the power to maybe adopt some of the Great New Deal, if not all of it? Because you can't do all this on your own.
Yeah, right. And I don't, that's not my role. I'm an economist, kind of an engineer, and I do the numbers. And so I'm advising politicians in Congress now, and I go to, and so people can pay attention to the efforts in Congress now to create universal pensions. Senator Hickenlooper, who's a Democrat from Colorado.
Colorado.
Okay.
We're formerly from
what city?
Colorado.
Well, okay, all right.
We're in
He's
Toledo now, but we've met Senator
Toledo.
Governor Hickenlooper at the time several times.
Yeah, no, he is, he listens to his constituency, I think because he was a mayor, right?
Yeah.
And he sells beer.
Yep, he does.
Those two things make him kind of a man of the people, and he's really embracing this universal pension.
That's great to hear.
But most important is that he's gotten a Republican to also embrace it. And this is Tom Tillis from North Carolina, who, lined me up with Tom Tillis on almost every issue, and I'm going to be on the opposite end. But in the one place that we agree is that everybody needs a dignified retirement. And that comes from, I think, his origins of growing up in a trailer. He lost his mother, and his father had a low-paid job, and they relied on Social Security. There are a lot of people in Congress that come from humble backgrounds, and Social Security was a big part of their life. And so Tom Tillis and John Hickenlooper in the Senate, and Terry Sewell, a Democrat from Alabama, and Lloyd Schmucker from Pennsylvania, not Ohio, but Pennsylvania, have come together as Republican and Democrat in the House. We're trying to get your guy, J.D. Vance, to be sympathetic to the hillbillies, and to
Right.
to the people he is supposed to be in touch with, to realize that their economic security is a subject for even a Republican governor. And so this is mainly a structure. This bill is called the Retirement Security Act for All Americans,
Mhm.
and you can find it by looking up Hickenlooper retirement bill. And what it would do is have everybody be able to save for their retirement in an account that's not connected to their employer.
Mhm.
And they would save up to 3%, and they would have a choice of funds that don't have conflicted advice and really low fees.
Mhm.
And the government, if you have low enough income, would also contribute 5%, and it would stay there for the rest of your career, and it would follow you just like Social Security follows you. So
Very
it
nice.
would be a way for you to build up an account on top of Social Security, like we used to have, to be
Right.
simple. So they should support the Retirement Security Act for all Americans. That's really important. And to vote for politicians that will shore up Medicare and Social Security.
Absolutely.
We'll definitely link to that in the show notes,
Yeah,
folks.
I was
so
not
you
aware of
can
that
check it
myself.
out.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a new question that we're asking all of our guests, just to the tone of the country right now. What is one thing that has you feeling positive about life right now, whether it's politics, retirement related, or completely
Personal.
something else?
A real defense of having people's voices heard. The protests on campus, though conflictual and maybe block some elevators and disrupt some graduation, whatever the issue is, is about young people wanting to have a voice, and also the unionization that is spreading in parts of the country. It's not the main parts of the country. It's not a Google or an Amazon. That's where Amazon a little bit, but we need some wins in the big employers. But also in my neck of the woods, this idea that Social Security cuts are unpopular, that Democrats and Republicans all agree that that we need a decent retirement plan. So I think what makes me positive is that ordinary people are speaking up.
I love that. Yeah, there was a period of time there where I wondered if college students even cared anymore. So I'm
Yeah.
actually excited to see
Yeah.
that, so hopefully there's no more
Yeah, they're
no more
finding
people
their
getting hurt.
voice. They're
Exactly.
finding their voice.
So our listeners and viewers who are on our
Law.
newsletter will learn how they might be able to win a free copy of your book. But for those who are less fortunate, where can they get a copy of your book, Work, Retire, Repeat?
In the same old places, Amazon, even though a granny might be filling your order. She'll boot a stupid bin from I hope your local bookstore. And then it's also, I just heard it's on audiobook too.
Oh, perfect.
So if people are like me, I like to listen to books while I'm walking or driving. It's also available, and it's short. So many people have looked at my book and said, "Oh my God, thank God it's short."
It's not a novella, no. Awesome.
And there's some, like I said, folks, the conversations that John and I had about the content of your book, it's a really good book to read with your partner. If you and your partner are thinking about retirement, or are thinking about planning for retirement, if you're in your 30s and 40s and you're thinking about planning for retirement, getting an accurate picture of what retirement looks like for people today is it. I don't want to scare you, but I think it does. It's a really good touchstone to what it's like for a lot of people in retirement, the average person, especially if you consider yourself and the average person and not a part of that, like you said, the people on the tail.
The tail, yeah.
Exactly. Awesome. And then finally, how can our listeners connect with you online? Are you on social media, website, whatnot?
I am, and it's easy to find me because my name isn't Jane Smith. It's Teresa Ghilarducci Retirement. I'm the only one, I think, in the world that those two, my name and that world intersect. So it's really easy to find me. And I love getting emails. So teresa.ghilarducci@gmail.com. A lot of people write to me about their own situation. It makes me, keeps me connected.
Awesome. Awesome. That's great to hear. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show, for sharing your knowledge and all the data. I think it's elicited great discussions for the two of us and hopefully for our listeners and viewers as well.
And I'm really glad I'm connected to Queer Money because I love your podcast. I listen to it a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Capital One Auto Navigator does more than just auto financing. We're here to help you find a car you love, too. Shop millions of cars from thousands of dealers nationwide. Research your favorite makes and models. Explore dealers near you and more. All on Auto Navigator.
Thank you, Teresa, for a warm, engaging, and informative interview and all the work you're doing to save America from its retirement crisis. Thank you, our listeners and viewers, for joining us for another episode. This week's newsletter includes your Career Money takeaway, instructions on how you could possibly win a copy of Teresa's book, Work, Retire, Repeat, and resources mentioned in this episode.
Then join us this Thursday when we have another bonus episode where we cover the top 5 most affordable places for LGBTQ plus retirees. And next Tuesday when we talk with intuitive healer Scott Clover about how to deal with and overcome money trauma. Thank you and have a great week.